So I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of my favourite books all about consulting. As you'll know, I'm a professor of consulting, so I spend too much time reading a lot of books. So you can't see it, but there and here I'm surrounded by books on consulting. I've got hundreds more in my offices. Now, as you all know, most books on consultancy are either number one, what the founder has done, so written from the perspective of somebody that has started and grown and sold very often their own firm. I don't like those generally because they generalize from a case of one, and you can't do that. What happened, what worked 20 years ago in Texas in the finance industry is going to be very different to what works for you. Um, the second thing that probably isn't relevant to a lot of, I guess, my connections on LinkedIn are ones on starting firms. There's lots of really good books on starting firms, but I'm not particularly interested in those. David Fields is a great one to follow. When I say starting, kind of from the 0 to 10, 15 people. Michael Zipersky is a good person to follow there. David Weiss is a good person to follow there. I'm really interested in what you have to do to build the architecture of a firm for long-term success, potentially sell it, increase the value of the firm, etc. So I'm kind of more interested in the 20 to 120 or 20 to the 200 mark. So these are some of my favorite firms. Books. I'm going to start off with the obvious ones. So David Meister, Managing the Professional Service Firm. Very good book for the larger firms. If you're running a boutique, all of his stuff about leverage may not be that relevant to you. I think this is more useful once you get to 200, 500, maybe 1,000 employees. It's out of date in some respects. He talks about fax machines, doesn't talk about emails. I think he's got a paragraph on technology, but still, the importance of trust is great in his book. So that's a really good one that I would recommend once you get bigger. So that's one of the obvious ones. He also obviously wrote The Trusted Advisor. Now, the thing is with David Meister is that he was number one, a professor from Harvard, but number two, the only person that was really writing about professional service firms in the 80s and 90s. So he didn't need to market. So he doesn't do anything on marketing. It's all about your reputation and your trusted relationships, which is fine for him to say, but the rest of us might struggle a little bit. Now, next one's a bit of an unknown, a secret. So this is Mark Scott's The Professional Service Firm. I personally think it's more useful than David Meister's work. I think it's useful for boutiques and those bigger than boutiques. It's very practical. It's got some really good diagrams. Big favourite of mine. Again, nearly 30 years old, like David Meister, so very little on technology, digitization, transformation, AI, but pretty useful. Another one that you might not have heard of is Aisha Armstrong's Productize. And it's actually self-published, which self-published books tend to be pretty awful unless there's a good reason. But as you can see from my notes in the back, there's a lot of interesting stuff I found there, and I ruin my books, unfortunately. So that's focused on people that want to turn their bespoke solutions into services and to turn services into products. Now, obviously, you don't always want to do that, and I'm not a big fan of using SaaS as products, but really useful, quite short, very accessible. Now, two books here from Tom McMakin. Wrote the first one, which is How Clients Buy, all about business development in professional service firms. Pretty good. There's a lot of obvious stuff in there, but sometimes we need to know the obvious stuff. He wrote this with Doug Fletcher. Now, after he wrote it, he realized that actually a lot of his clients, so he's a sales sort of consultant to the consulting industry, he realized a lot of his clients actually expand their accounts rather than getting new clients. So then he wrote Never Say Sell, which is, I think, much better than How Clients Buy. And there's some really good tips on there on account development. As you can see from the number of turned down pages, very much like it. The fifth I would recommend is The Boutique by Greg Alexander. For those of you that don't know, Greg Alexander runs a US kind of mastermind group called Collective 54. He sold his own firm for, I think, $200 million. He's got a very kind of machine-based approach to growth, but you can apply it with success. It's a very accessible book. It's a very simple book. He's got nice checklists at the back of it, every chapter. It's kind of helping people go from the small firm to the firm that's ready to sell. Very much based on that trajectory, so not necessarily useful for you if you want to build a firm that you want to keep. He also wrote The Founder Bottleneck, which unfortunately you can't get unless you're a member of Collective 54. He very kindly sent me a copy of it because we know each other quite well. Very good. My own book, if you don't mind me mentioning it, Growth. This is evidence-based for those of you that haven't read it. So I interviewed, on top of my own clients, my own experience, I interviewed 100 people that had grown and sold their firms and really took lessons from all of that through each aspect of the growing professional service firm. So that's more, again, it's a bit big. It's 100,000 words. It's perhaps a little too academic for some people. And one day I'll write a more accessible version of it. So that's my own book. David Meister's Trusted Advisor, for those of you who mentioned that earlier. Now, this is a bit of a sneaky one. This is Timothy Galpin's Winning at the Acquisition Game. It's actually written for people that might want to buy your professional service firm. I like it because I like to know what the enemy's thinking. So if you're coming up to sale, and you're starting to go into, starting to find brokers or banks or starting to, get approached by people, it's a good thing to buy and read just to look at the bigger context of what you're getting yourself into and how it's going to work, and really the buyer's mind. So you obviously know your client's minds, but you might not know your buyer's minds. Now, these two last books, again, I'm a big fan of evidence-based advice. These two last books aren't specifically about the consulting industry, but they are very highly evidence-based, which I really appreciate. They're quite big because of that. But the first is Jim Collins' Good to Great, which I would, is very much evidence-based about how you take a good firm to become a great firm. Now, as with all of these studies, retrospectively, he named a lot of firms that ended up tanking, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was wrong. Some of the principles he brings out there, I think, are relevant still 20 years later. So that was published in, I think, 2002. And the final one is Colin Price's book that my friend Tomo at Muto Consulting reminded me of, and I completely forgot. I'm actually halfway through reading it. But the half that I've read is actually really good. So Colin Price was a McKinsey partner who did a fairly extensive study of how firms accelerate their performance. Again, a really, really good one. And the final one, it's not in my pile, but I've just seen it. My pile's getting a bit wobbly here. The final one is this one, which most people haven't heard of. So it's Jules Goddard, who, and this, I only came to my attention because it won the Chartered Management Institute Book of the Year. And the lesson, there's lots of different lessons in here. It's quite a nice sort of toilet book if you're into that type of thing. No reason why you should be. And I quite liked it because of the lessons around innovation. That if you don't invest in innovation in the long term, you will lose out. There's lots of arguments around that. But he also talks about strategy and lots of other things. He's a professor, I think, at the London School of Economics. Anyway, my top 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 books that not expecting you to read, but yeah, they all have good insights. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.